Hi everybody, you're with Tacitus Today at your Pushback channel. So let's do some more pushing back against those crazy SJWs and the globalists. Freedom of speech. What is it? How can it be defined? What is its value in Western society or any society? What social building blocks support free speech, and in turn, which social building blocks are enhanced or threatened by its loss or undermining? Other than directly inciting physical violence or group panic, libelous writings and slanderous utterances, should all speech be free? Is offence to speech given or taken by those who choose and try so very, very hard to be offended? Should a professional outrage industry, as we see today, thick with well-funded radical activists, be so casually encouraged to ever greater demands and excesses? Perhaps the real test of your commitment and my commitment to free speech is, would you defend the right to speak of someone you and those around you did not agree with or did not like? Free speech is not simply a matter of letting others speak, but also defending their right to do so. One of the better examples in modern history of defending free speech and free association came about in the early 1950s, out of all places, in Australia, and in a time very different from today. The times were fractious. The prospect of a nuclear war loomed large over the world. The fear was genuine. Communist Soviet Russia had one by one infiltrated and taken over the states of Eastern Europe, and then had exploded an atomic bomb. Previously, only America had that technology, and now the Soviet communists did. China had fallen to communist forces 2 years previous, and communist infiltrations were supported and funded by Russia and China all across Southeast Asia and elsewhere. French forces were fighting communists in what is modern-day Vietnam and Laos. The armies of communism had attempted to seize Korea in 1950, almost succeeding before American General MacArthur, commanding UN forces, launched a seaborne counterattack at Incheon, dealing the communists a crushing defeat. China had then entered the Korean War, and the struggle had simply intensified. Soviet-trained and funded agitators were all over the Western polities, targeting teachers and academics, gay, lesbians, and any minority they thought they could stir up. Soviet spies were also in Australia, adding to a sense of siege and paranoia. Double agents and Soviet infiltration were discovered and reported frequently by a frothing media almost on a daily basis. Australian Prime Ministers of the time would go to Washington, asking the US President to sign a treaty to come to Australia's aid if attacked by communist forces. Upon returning to Australia, the population were told the Prime Minister would be making an address to the nation. TVs and radios as one switched to a broadcast from the Prime Minister. Australian families solemnly gathered around. The PM, with gravitas appropriate to the occasion, would assure a nervous Australian public the American President had signed a treaty pledging to come to Australia's aid if attacked. The signed treaty would be held up as proof. Footage of the US President and of the US Pacific Fleet, bristling with high-tech weapons of the day, allowed for an audible sigh of relief to sweep the nation. Australia was safe for another day. It is into this climate that the ultimate test of free speech and freedom of association took place, and it went like this. In late 1949, the Australian federal election had elected a Conservative Republican government with a handsome majority in the House of Representatives, but not a majority in the Senate. The Conservatives had campaigned during the election outlawing the Communist Party, among other things. In 1950, the government, after some haggling and fierce debate in the Senate, passed legislation to outlaw the Communist Party and the preaching or practicing of communism in Australia. The burden of proof for the state to arrest and charge someone with being a communist was very low. The rationale: evildoers, that is communists, do not deserve legal rights and they must be rooted out and punished. The legislation allowed for those deemed as communists to be arrested and imprisoned, with the state only needing to meet, as mentioned above, a low burden of proof. Take particular note here. The demonisation of people or a group for what they may believe, and then most importantly, adding this lowered burden of proof, which in effect reverses the burden of proof. So the accused must prove their innocence. It is this combination, it is this clandestine tampering with due legal process that should always be a marker and a flashing red light whenever you see this occurring. Thankfully though, in a rule of law democracy, it's not always that easy to so publicly dispense with the rights of the citizenry. The Communist Party, assisted by those who believed in a democracy, freedom of association, were critical of and opposed this new legislation and took it to the Supreme Court. The court was hardly a hotbed of communist sympathy, far from it in fact. But it was an independent court of law, sufficiently concerned with the rule of law and due legal process. It is an illustration of how these judges kept their heads and ruled on the law and the Constitution, as they should. Activists may like the idea of stacked courts, but such courts can easily become enemies of the people once they become ideological activists first and jurists second. As the judges deliberated, freedom of speech and freedom of association hung in the balance. Perhaps the irony of the whole exercise was if the communists had won government, the first thing they would have done would be to shut down free speech and freedom of association. The communists, again ironically, were being protected by those who would be the first to be taken out back and shot if the communists ever took over. In the event, those supporting freedom of association won. They won with the judges voting 6-1 that the act to outlaw communism was invalid according to the law and the Constitution. Freedom of speech and freedom of association had won, for now. The government countered, however, and returned to the people for another federal election, but only this time they had a majority in the Senate. After much legal hand-wringing, the government decided and received advice that they could not outlaw the Communist Party, particularly given the previous legal judgment. Legally, therefore, it must be the people's decision, and the referendum was called, which would allow the government to override the Supreme Court verdict. Quite rightly, only the people should have such power. Both sides, for and against, went out to make their case to the voters to prepare for the referendum. An Australian referendum is not just a matter of falling over the line with a simple majority. It requires both a majority of votes and a majority of states if it is to pass. The public debate was at times frenzied and impassioned, reflecting the high stakes at hand. Those who had no sympathy for communism often spoke just as passionately as any communists in defence of free speech. Town halls, town squares became speaking venues, with sometimes only a handful of people turning up and other times packed with standing room only. But all this argument, all this debate, would it be enough? The rubber met the road on referendum election day on September 22nd, 1951. As counting progressed, it seemed the communists would be outlawed by the end of the night, and anyone from then on, the state accused of being a communist, could be arbitrarily arrested and detained without proper due legal process. In the end, a mere 52,000 votes and a majority of just one state decided the outcome. What was that outcome? The proposal to outlaw the Communist Party was defeated. Free speech and freedom of association had won, but only just. At the time, it was seen as a victory for communism. The communists had won. But was it in fact a victory? It was a victory for everybody, as free speech protects everybody, particularly from the arbitrary excesses of the state. Once removed, one day the loss of free speech will be turned on you. And what will you do then? Where will you hide? So many people today want free speech to be restricted. What we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. This is Tacitus Today, and thank you for listening.